My own front porch looked unfamiliar under that warm yellow light, like it belonged to someone else and I was the one trespassing. I just rinsed my tea mug and was heading to bed when the doorbell rang, sharp and impatient, the kind of ring that doesn't ask, it announces. When I opened the door, my daughter-in-law stood there with 2 suitcases parked beside her like a statement. Not a weekend bag, not a quick visit. 2 full suitcases, upright, handles extended, her posture straight, her face set like this was already decided. I didn't even get a hello before she leaned forward and glanced past me into the hallway, measuring the house with her eyes as if she was mentally rearranging it. Before I could process why she was on my doorstep at that hour, she rolled the first suitcase over my threshold. The wheels clicked over the seam in the doorway, and that small sound landed in my chest heavier than it should have. I looked at her hands on the handle, then at the second suitcase, and I felt something old in me wake up, something that had been quiet for years, the part of me that remembered exactly how much I'd worked for this roof and how many times I'd been the one who swallowed discomfort to keep the peace. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just asked, as evenly as I could, "Did you ask the owner of the house for permission?" She paused like my question was a cute little joke she'd heard before. Her mouth lifted slightly, not a smile, more like a warning wrapped in politeness. She said my son told her it was fine. That was the first time my stomach tightened, because I'd learned the hard way that when someone says something is fine, what they really mean is it's convenient for them and they expect you to fall in line. I asked where my son was, even though I already knew. You can feel when someone is hiding behind another person. A moment later, he stepped into view from the driveway, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, eyes not quite meeting mine, his face carrying that strained look he gets when he wants to avoid conflict but has already picked a side. He started explaining before I asked him anything, talking quickly, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves. He said it was temporary. He said they needed space. He said it was better this way. He said things like, just for a little while, and don't make it a big deal. Like the big deal wasn't the fact that my home was being entered like it was a hotel reservation he'd made on an app. My daughter-in-law kept her eyes on me while he spoke, like she was waiting for me to react so she could label it something ugly. Emotional, difficult, unstable. She didn't look nervous. She looked prepared, like she'd rehearsed the moment in her head and decided how it would play out. I stepped back from the doorway, not because I agreed, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of watching me block the entrance and look desperate. She rolled the second suitcase in. The smell of her perfume hit the air, sweet and expensive, out of place in my quiet hallway. She glanced at the coat rack, at my framed family photos, at the little side table I'd had for years, and I caught the smallest shift in her expression, like she'd just walked into a place she planned to claim. My son finally looked at me then, just for a second, and that look stung more than any argument. It wasn't love. It wasn't respect. It was a plea for compliance. I asked him calmly why I was finding out like this on my doorstep at night with luggage already inside. He said he didn't want a scene. He said I'd overthink it. He said his wife had been stressed and they needed support. Support. The word landed wrong because support is something you ask for, not something you take. My daughter-in-law cut in softly, not loud enough to seem rude, but sharp enough to land. She said she hoped we could all be adults, and that she didn't want negativity. She said it while standing in my entryway like she'd bought the place, as if my boundaries were the negativity. If you're listening right now, tell me where you're listening from, and if your own family has ever made you feel like you don't get a say in your own life, drop "I relate" in the comments. Because what happened next wasn't an argument, and it wasn't a shouting match. It was worse. It was that quiet moment when you realize someone you raised is willing to let you be pushed aside, as long as it keeps their life comfortable. I looked past them at my living room, the sofa where I'd sat through layoffs and medical scares and nights I didn't know how I'd make it, the same space where I'd celebrated little wins nobody else noticed. My daughter-in-law set her handbag on my side table like she'd done it 100 times. My son followed her in, glancing around like he was checking whether my home still felt like mine. And in that moment, I understood this wasn't about a simple stay. This was a test. A takeover dressed up as family. I didn't shout. I didn't demand they leave. Not yet. I just closed the door slowly behind them, the latch clicking into place, and I watched my daughter-in-law's shoulders relax as if she'd won something. My son exhaled like the hard part was over. But for me, the hard part was just beginning, because now I had to decide whether I would keep playing the role they'd written for me, or whether I'd finally remind them whose name was on everything that mattered. As my daughter-in-law rolled her suitcases down the hall like she belonged there, I stood still for a beat, then turned and followed, already feeling that old calm settle in, the calm that comes right before you take control. By the time she reached the guest room, she was already talking like she'd been living there for months, asking where I kept extra hangers, whether the blinds worked properly, whether the Wi-Fi was strong enough for video calls. My son hovered behind her, carrying a garment bag like an assistant, nodding along as if this was all normal. I stood in the doorway and watched her unzip the first suitcase. The sound of the zipper felt too loud in that small room, like it was opening more than luggage. I told them we needed to sit down for a minute. Not to argue, just to get something clear. My daughter-in-law didn't look up right away like she could multitask through my boundaries. My son did what he always does when he's uncomfortable. He tried to soften it with a half laugh. "Mum, it's late. Can we do this tomorrow?" I said no. Because tomorrow is how people slide into your life and make permanent changes while you're still trying to be polite. We sat in the living room. She chose the armchair closest to the hallway like she wanted a clear view of the house. My son took the sofa, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, eyes on the floor. I stayed standing. I told them two things. First, nobody moves into my home without asking me directly, not through my son, not through assumptions, not through pressure. Second, if they were staying, it would be temporary and we would agree on a date, an actual date, not a little while. Not until things settle. My daughter-in-law finally smiled, small and controlled. She said, "We're family. Why are you making it formal?" And I realized that was her trick. If I said yes, it was love. If I said no, it was cruelty. I told her family is exactly why it has to be clear, because family is where people feel most entitled to take. My son looked up fast at that, like he wanted to interrupt, but he didn't. Then she tried a different angle. She said they'd been under pressure and they just needed a safe place for a bit. She said the landlord was being difficult. She said the neighbors complained. She said she couldn't sleep. She built a whole emotional story in front of me, carefully arranged, like props on a stage. And still, she never once said, "May we stay with you?" She talked as if they already were. I asked my son directly what happened. He hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than his words. He said there'd been a misunderstanding with their lease. He said it wasn't a big deal. He said it would be sorted soon. I asked him why he didn't tell me earlier. He shrugged and said, "Because you'd worry?" "No, because I might say no." My daughter-in-law leaned back and crossed her legs, and that's when she started getting comfortable in a way that didn't match someone who was a guest. She said she'd make changes around the house, just small things, because the place felt a bit dated. She said it like she was doing me a favor. My son nodded again, still not looking at me, like agreement was easier than respect. That was the moment I stopped playing along. I walked to the sideboard where I keep my folder of important papers, the one I never needed anyone else to know about. I didn't wave it around. I didn't dramatize it. I simply placed a blank notepad on the coffee table and wrote one line at the top, "House agreement." My son's head snapped up. My daughter-in-law's smile tightened. I wrote 3 rules beneath it slowly so there would be no misunderstanding later. No moving furniture. No inviting guests over. No entering my bedroom or office for any reason. Then I wrote the 4th line and paused just long enough to watch them both react. Move-out date, 2 weeks from today. I looked up at my son and said calmly, "If you needed help, you should have asked. You didn't, so this is the help I'm offering." My daughter-in-law laughed, short and sharp, like she couldn't believe I'd spoken to her like an equal. She said 2 weeks was impossible. She said I was being heartless. She said she thought I was the kind of woman who supported her family. My son finally spoke, voice strained, telling me I was being unfair, that I was choosing rules over people. I asked him whether he'd feel the same if someone walked into his home unannounced with 2 suitcases and started redecor. "Aiding." He didn't answer. He just stared at the paper like it was an insult. My daughter-in-law reached toward the notepad as if she could tear it up and make it disappear. I slid it slightly out of her reach and said she didn't have to sign anything. It wasn't a negotiation. It was my home. She held my gaze then, and for the first time her expression cracked into something colder. She said, "Fine, but don't blame me for what happens next." That line landed like a threat, dressed as a warning. My son stood up quickly and said we were tired and we'd talk in the morning. He tried to end it there, like he could close the conversation the way he closes a door. But as they walked away, I saw it clearly. They weren't here because they needed help. They were here because they assumed I would fold. And now that I hadn't, they were going to turn my own house into a courtroom, and I was going to be the accused. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was scared of them, but because I was thinking about what my son had really been hiding. About why his wife looked so confident walking into a situation she should have been embarrassed by. About the way she'd said, "What happens next?" like she already had a plan. And just before dawn, when the house was silent and the air felt thin, my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. A routine alert, a small line of text. One payment attempt. Declined, then another, declined again. I sat up in bed, heart steady, mind suddenly clear, because I recognized the pattern instantly. Someone was trying to use something they didn't own. At breakfast, my daughter-in-law acted like nothing happened. She moved around my kitchen like she'd memorized it overnight, opening drawers without asking, placing mugs on the counter as if she'd bought them. My son sat quiet, phone in hand, scrolling like he could hide inside the screen. I watched them both and let the silence do its job. People get careless when they think you won't push back. She finally brought it up in a light voice, the way you mention a canceled delivery. She said 2 weeks wasn't realistic, and she'd already told her sister they'd be here for a while. Then she added, almost sweetly, that she'd been looking at local schools for the future, like she was planting roots in my living room. My son cleared his throat and said, "Mum, just be flexible." Flexible. In my own house. I asked them again why they really left their place. This time my daughter-in-law answered too fast. She said the landlord was selling, that the notice came suddenly, that they were basically homeless. I looked straight at my son. I asked if that was true. He didn't say yes. He said, "It's complicated." That's when I knew the story was built for me, not with me. While they were still at the table, I stepped into my office and opened my laptop. I didn't need to spy. I needed facts. A lease notice would mean emails, messages, a paper trail, something. Instead, what I found was a calendar reminder my son had used on my computer months ago when he visited. Meet with broker. Another one, mortgage call. My stomach didn't drop. It hardened. This wasn't a sudden eviction. This was a plan. When I came back into the kitchen, my daughter-in-law was on a video call, laughing softly, camera angled to hide the mess of suitcases still in the hallway. She ended the call and said she was just updating family. Then she looked at me and said, "It'll be easier if you just let us settle in." Easier for who? I told them 2 weeks stood. My daughter-in-law's face changed in a blink like a mask sliding off. She said I was punishing them. She said I was choosing control over love. Then she did something that shocked me more than the words. She turned to my son and said loudly, "Tell her," like she was cueing him on stage. My son finally looked at me properly. His eyes were tired, but there was something else too, something rehearsed. He said, "Mum, you can't just throw us out." And then he said the sentence I'll never forget. "This is our family home too." I stared at him. "No," I said, "it's not. Calm, simple, true." My daughter-in-law leaned forward. "Actually," she said, "we spoke to someone, and we were told because you're older and you live alone, the house should be protected, shared, managed, for your safety." The way she said older made it feel like an accusation. My son nodded like he'd been coached. He said he was worried about me, that I forget things sometimes, that I've been stubborn, that maybe it's time he helped handle my affairs. That's when I understood what this was, not an argument about suitcases, a takeover dressed as concern. I asked him who he spoke to. He hesitated, then said a name I didn't recognize, some advisor a friend recommended. My daughter-in-law jumped in and said they could get paperwork started and make it smooth. Then she smiled again like she'd offered me a gift. My son added, almost apologetically, "It's just to Mac. Things easier, Mum. You won't have to worry." I walked to the hallway table where their bags were stacked and picked up a large envelope that had been slipped under my door that morning. I hadn't opened it yet because I didn't recognize the return address. Now I did. It was from my bank's legal department. I opened it in front of them and pulled out the letter. My daughter-in-law's smile flickered. My son went pale. The letter was polite, formal, and very clear. It said there had been multiple attempts to access my accounts using an authorization that did not match my records. It asked me to confirm whether I had appointed a power of attorney. It included a photocopy of the document that someone had submitted. I didn't need to read it all. I just turned the page so they could see the signature line. My name was there. And it wasn't my handwriting. My son stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Mum, I didn't," he started, but his voice cracked. My daughter-in-law grabbed his arm like she was trying to hold him still, keep him from ruining whatever story she'd built. She looked at me and said, "Sharp, don't be dramatic. It's probably a mistake." A mistake doesn't forge a signature. I asked them one question, just one. "Who signed this?" My son looked at his wife. His wife looked back at him like she was warning him not to answer. And in that tiny pause, I saw the truth move between them like a secret. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I walked back into my office, picked up my phone, and called the one person I trusted to tell me the truth without softening it. My solicitor. When she answered, I said, "I need you to come to my house today, and I need you to bring someone who handles fraud." Behind me, in the kitchen, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice drop into a hissed panic. I heard my son say my name like he was pleading. And for the first time since they arrived with those suitcases, they finally understood something I'd been trying to make clear from the start. I wasn't a soft target. My solicitor arrived with a calm face and a hard briefcase, the kind of calm that only comes from seeing ugly things every day. She didn't sit in my living room like a guest. She stood like she owned the air. She asked for the letter from the bank, took one look at the copy of the so-called power of attorney and said, "This is not valid, and whoever submitted it took a serious risk." My son tried to speak, but she held up one finger and kept her eyes on me, not him. "Do you feel safe in your home right now?" she asked. I said no, because safety isn't just about violence, it's about control. My daughter-in-law snapped that nobody was threatening me, that I was overreacting, that this was family. My solicitor didn't even blink. She said, "Family can still commit fraud." The room went quiet in a way that made my daughter-in-law shift her weight like the floor had turned slippery. My son's face kept changing, guilt, fear, anger, then back to guilt again. He looked like a man who had talked himself into believing he was doing the right thing and was now watching that lie fall apart. My solicitor asked a few simple questions. Who introduced you to the advisor? Who filled out the forms? Who scanned the documents? My son started with, "I don't know," and it was just guidance, but my daughter-in-law kept answering for him, too quickly, too confidently. She said she handled the admin, that my son was stressed, that she was only trying to help. Then she made her biggest mistake. She said, "You should be grateful someone is finally taking responsibility." My solicitor asked to see their phone records with the advisor's number. My son hesitated and said he'd rather not. My solicitor nodded once like she expected that. Then she told him calmly that refusing to cooperate would not protect him. It would only make him look involved. My son swallowed hard and unlocked his phone with shaking hands. He handed it over like it weighed 100 pounds. 2 minutes, that's all it took. The number wasn't saved as an advisor. It was saved under a woman's name, my daughter-in-law's sister. My son whispered, "No," not like denial, like heartbreak. Like he just realized he wasn't the partner in his marriage, he was the tool. My daughter-in-law's face hardened and she tried to snatch the phone back, but my solicitor stepped between them and said, "Do not touch evidence." That word evidence changed everything. My daughter-in-law turned on me then, fully. She said I was trying to ruin my son's marriage. She said I hated her from day one. She said I was jealous, bitter, lonely, and scared of losing him. It was a speech she'd been saving. I listened without blinking, because that's what you do when someone finally shows you exactly who they are. My son looked at her like he didn't recognize her. And maybe he didn't. Maybe he only ever knew the version of her that served him. My solicitor told them both that they needed to leave the property. Why for the day while she made calls? My daughter-in-law laughed like that was adorable. She said, "We live here now." My son didn't correct her, not immediately. He just stood there, stuck between the woman he married and the mother he'd just helped corner. I walked to the hallway and pointed at the suitcases. "Take them," I said. My voice didn't shake. "You're not staying another night." My daughter-in-law stepped forward and said, low and venomous, "You can't kick us out, he's your son." Then she looked at my son and said, "Tell her," again, that little command. My son opened his mouth, and for a second I thought he would choose her. Old habits, old guilt. Then he looked at the document on the table again, the forged signature, the bank's warning, and his shoulders dropped like something in him finally broke. He didn't defend her, he didn't defend me either. He just said, "What did you do?" And he wasn't talking to me. My daughter-in-law's eyes widened for half a second before she recovered. She said, "I did what I had to do for us." She said it like love, but it sounded like entitlement. My solicitor stepped outside to make calls, and I followed her to the front step. In the driveway, her assistant was already on the phone to a locksmith, and another call went to my bank. She asked me if I had any spare keys floating around, any copies given to my son. I told her yes, years ago, for emergencies. She nodded like she'd expected it. "We're going to change every lock today," she said. "And we're going to notify your bank in writing that any power of attorney submitted without you present is fraudulent." Inside, the house went loud again. My daughter-in-law was packing with furious movements, throwing things into bags like she was punishing the fabric. My son stood still, staring at the floor, then he suddenly walked into my kitchen and opened a drawer. The drawer where I keep my house documents. He froze when he saw it was empty. Because I had moved them months ago. Not because I expected this exact moment, but because I learned a long time ago that if someone keeps asking questions about what you own, it's not curiosity. It's planning. My son looked up at me and said quietly, "Where are they?" I didn't answer him. I asked him something else. "Did you really think I would sign away my home without speaking to my solicitor?" He rubbed his face like he was in pain. "She said it was temporary," he murmured. "She said it was just to help with budgeting and future planning." He said it like he needed me to believe he wasn't cruel, just foolish. I didn't comfort him. Comfort is what you give after accountability, not before it. The locksmith arrived faster than I expected. He walked in with a toolbox and a professional smile that dropped the second he felt the atmosphere. He got to work without small talk. While he worked, my solicitor came back in and said the words my daughter-in-law didn't expect to hear. "We've filed an initial report. If any money moved, there will be an investigation." My daughter-in-law stopped mid-pack. "Report," she repeated, as if she'd never heard the word before. My solicitor nodded. "Fraud is fraud," she said, "and forging a signature is not a misunderstanding." My daughter-in-law's voice rose. She demanded my son do something. She demanded he handle his mother. She said if he didn't, she'd leave him. She said it like a threat that always worked. My son didn't answer her. He just picked up one suitcase, then another, and carried them to the door. His face was blank in the worst way, like he was finally seeing the full cost of what he'd helped build. My daughter-in-law followed him, furious, still arguing, still trying to pull him back into her story where I was the villain. At the threshold, she turned to me one last time and said, "You'll regret this." I looked at her and said, "I already regret trusting you in my home." The door closed behind them. The locksmith clicked the new lock into place like a final sentence. And for the first time in days, the house felt like mine again. But I wasn't finished, because changing locks protects your home. It doesn't protect your name. The next morning, my bank manager called me personally, not with the usual polite cheer, but with that careful tone people use when they're trying not to scare you. She told me there had been attempts to access my accounts through authorized channels, and when those failed, there were new requests submitted late in the evening, as if someone assumed I'd be asleep and easier to bypass. The requests weren't approved, but the pattern was clear. They weren't backing off, they were escalating. I thanked her, asked her to lock everything down so nothing moved without me physically present, and then I sat at my kitchen table staring at my own hands, realizing how close I'd come to losing everything because I loved my child. An hour later, my son texted me like nothing had happened. No apology, no explanation, just a message that made my stomach twist. He said his in-laws wanted to clear the air over dinner, and it would mean a lot if I came. He added one line that told me exactly whose voice was behind the screen. "Let's not involve solicitors, it's embarrassing." I read it 3 times, embarrassing. Not wrong, not dangerous, embarrassing. I didn't reply straight away. I called my solicitor instead and told her what he'd sent. She didn't hesitate. She said, "That's not a peace offering, that's a setup." I wanted to argue. I wanted to believe my son couldn't still be under her control after everything, but my solicitor asked me one question that shut that hope down. "Did he ask how you are?" He hadn't, not once. I felt my chest go tight. My solicitor told me if I went, I would not go alone, and if they tried anything, we would document it properly. I hated that this was my life now, planning like I was dealing with strangers, not family. But I agreed, because denial is how people like my daughter-in-law win. The dinner was at a shiny restaurant with dim lighting and expensive confidence, the kind of place where the staff look through you if you're not dressed in labels. I wore a simple coat and a scarf, nothing dramatic, and I walked in with my solicitor beside me. My son was already there, sitting stiffly, eyes darting like a boy waiting to be scolded. Across from him sat his mother-in-law, the first time I'd seen her up close. She smiled at me the way people smile when they're about to insult you, sweet on top, sharp underneath. Her husband sat beside her, quiet and watchful, and my daughter-in-law sat like a queen at the center, calm because she believed she'd already won. They didn't stand. They didn't greet me. They just waited for me to take the seat they'd left open, the seat that placed me with my back to the room like a target. My solicitor took that seat instead and guided me to the chair where I could see everyone clearly. That small change annoyed my daughter-in-law immediately. I saw it in the twitch at the corner of her mouth. She didn't like losing control of the frame. The conversation started fake. Her mother spoke about family harmony, about how these misunderstandings happen, about how she respected elders. Then she slid in the poison. She said my son had told them I was forgetful lately, that I was stressed, that maybe I wasn't thinking clearly, and they were only worried. I felt my son flinch at that, and I wanted to reach across the table and shake him, because if you let people call your mother unstable, you're handing them a weapon. My solicitor leaned in slightly and asked, very calmly, "Are you stating that you believe my client lacks capacity?" The mother-in-law blinked, caught off guard by the directness, then she laughed and said, "Oh no, nothing like that. We just think she should have support." Support. Another soft word hiding a hard intention. Then my daughter-in-law finally spoke. She said they didn't want drama, they didn't want courts, they didn't want police. She said they wanted a simple solution where everyone feels safe. And then she placed a folder on the table like she was handing over peace. She pushed it toward me. "We drafted something fair," she said. "Just temporary, just to calm things down." I didn't touch it, my solicitor did. Inside were papers that looked official enough to trick someone who wanted to believe. They were framed as a family agreement, but the language was clear if you knew what you were reading. It gave my son temporary authority to manage my property for health and safety reasons. It offered me a monthly allowance from my own money. It even included a section about relocating me to assisted living if I became uncooperative. I stared at that line and felt my throat go dry. Assisted living. Uncooperative. They were not negotiating with me. They were planning to remove me. My son said quietly, "Mum, it's not like that." But his voice cracked, and I knew he was lying to himself more than to me. My daughter-in-law didn't even look at him. She just watched me, waiting for fear, waiting for me to fold. Her mother leaned forward and said, "You're older, you don't need all that space. Let the young couple start their life. You can live comfortably somewhere else." Her tone was polite, but her eyes were greedy. That's when I understood it wasn't only my daughter-in-law. This was a family business. They weren't protecting my son from me. They were using my son to get to me. My solicitor closed the folder and slid it back across the table like it was contaminated. "No," she said, one word, "clean, final." My daughter-in-law's expression shifted, irritation bleeding into anger. She said, "Then we have a problem." She said it softly, but I felt the threat in it. She looked at my son and said, "Tell her," again, that same little command like a leash. My son's hands clenched. He looked at me, and for a second I saw the child I raised, the boy who was. Ed to cry when he thought he'd disappointed me. Then the adult mask came back on, and he said something that felt like a slap. He said, "Mum, you're making this harder than it needs to be." I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I just looked at him and said, "Harder for who?" Silence landed like a weight. He didn't answer because the truth was ugly. Harder for him, harder for his marriage, harder for his in-laws, harder for their plan. That's when my solicitor did something I will never forget. She took out her phone, opened an email, and pushed it toward the mother-in-law. It was a notice from my bank's legal department confirming there had been attempted submissions of authority documents with irregularities, and that any further attempts would trigger a formal fraud investigation. The mother-in-law's face tightened. My daughter-in-law's eyes flashed. My son went pale. The father-in-law finally spoke. His voice was low, like a door closing. He said, "This is getting serious." My solicitor nodded. "It already is," she said. "You just didn't expect to be challenged." My daughter-in-law leaned back and smiled, but it wasn't warmth. It was calculation. She said, "Fine. If you want to do it the hard way, we'll do it the hard way." Then she looked at my son and said, loud enough for the table next to us to hear, "I want a divorce." The restaurant went quiet around us, the kind of quiet where people pretend they're not listening while they listen harder. My son's face went blank. He whispered her name like a warning. She didn't care. She wanted the threat to land. She wanted me to feel responsible. But the moment she said it, something snapped into place for me, because I finally understood what this dinner really was. It wasn't a trap for me. It was a trap for my son. She thought she could corner him between his mother and his marriage and force him to choose her by shame and fear. She thought he would do what he always did, sacrifice me to keep her happy. She miscalculated one thing. I wasn't the only one with paperwork. And my son wasn't the only one whose name was on it. I stood up slowly, picked up my coat, and looked at my daughter-in-law with a calm that made her eyes narrow. "If you want a divorce," I said, "you should know what you're actually divorcing." My son stared at me. "What do you mean?" I didn't answer him there. Not yet. I nodded once at my solicitor, and we walked out, leaving them at that table with their expensive plates and their cheap intentions. Behind me, I heard my daughter-in-law's mother hissing at my son, and my son finally raising his voice back, not for me, but for himself. That was new. And it was exactly what my daughter-in-law feared. The hallway went quiet in that special way it does when people realize a scene is about to turn into a decision. My daughter-in-law stood there with the suitcases like a performance, chin slightly lifted, waiting for me to flinch or soften. My son hovered just behind her shoulder, tense and irritated, like he'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head and still hated that I existed inside it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush forward. I just looked at the luggage, then at the two of them, and asked the question slowly, clearly, like I was reading a line off a legal document. "Did you ask the owner of the house for permission?" It wasn't dramatic. That was the point. Drama is what people use when they don't have authority. The moment those words landed, my daughter-in-law's expression shifted, a flicker of confusion crossing her face, then annoyance, as if I'd broken the script she'd written for me. My son tried to laugh it off, the same dismissive laugh he'd been using for months, the one that said my opinions were old and inconvenient. But his laugh died halfway because I didn't move. I didn't argue. I just waited, and silence has a way of forcing truth to stand up. My daughter-in-law turned to my son the way people do when they expect backup, and he stepped forward like he was about to do what he always did, speak over me, make it sound like I was the problem, make it sound like I was being difficult. He started with the usual, the soft insults dressed as concern, telling me I was overthinking, that it was just temporary, that I should be happy they were building their life. Then he slid in the real knife, the line meant to put me back in my place. "It's my house too, Mama." That's when I watched his confidence betray him, because he said it like he believed it, not like he knew it. And there's a difference. Belief is for children. Ownership is for adults. I let him finish. I let him fill the air with all the entitlement he'd collected from someone else's mouth. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out a slim folder, and set it gently on the console table like I was placing down a tray of tea. No show, no shaking hands, just paper, weight, consequence. I told them I wasn't here to argue about feelings. I was here to correct a misunderstanding. Ending that had gotten too comfortable. The house wasn't ours. It was his. It wasn't something my daughter-in-law could claim with luggage and a confident tone. The deed was not in my son's name. The mortgage was not in my son's name. The responsibility, the taxes, the insurance, the repairs that kept this place alive were not his. He'd been living inside my patience and calling it his property. I watched my daughter-in-law's eyes drop to the folder like it was a threat, because for people who play power games, proof feels like violence. My son tried to grab it, quick and instinctive, like if he could touch it first he could control what it meant, but I pulled it back calmly and told him no. You don't get to snatch your way into authority. I opened it myself and showed them the page that mattered, the one with the name, the one with the signature, the one with the date that didn't care about their excuses. My daughter-in-law's face drained just a little, and my son's jaw tightened so hard it looked like it hurt. And I could tell, right then, that he'd been repeating a lie to himself for so long he'd started to treat it like a fact. The next part was the part they never expect from someone they've been dismissing. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I didn't start listing every disrespect like a grocery receipt. I told them exactly what would happen next, not as a threat, but as a schedule. No one was moving into my home without my written permission. No one was bringing suitcases up my stairs and turning my living room into a battlefield. If they wanted to live together, they could do it in a place they paid for. If they wanted to start a family, they could do it without using my roof as their shortcut. And if my son wanted to keep pretending he could override me, he was welcome to test that belief in court, where feelings don't count and signatures do. I saw my daughter-in-law's eyes narrow, and for a second I could practically hear her thinking about how to spin this, how to make me look cruel. She opened her mouth to say something sharp, something about respect, something about elders, something about a mother should support her son. But my son stopped her because he finally understood the danger wasn't my temper, it was my calm. And that's where the begging started, not the dramatic kind, not crying on the floor, but the bargaining that always comes when control slips. My son's voice softened fast, switching from authority to negotiation, asking if we could talk, if we could figure it out, if I could just give them time. He offered promises the way he used to offer apologies, quick, convenient, designed to reset everything back to normal. My daughter-in-law tried a different angle, suddenly polite, suddenly careful, saying she didn't mean any disrespect, saying they were under pressure, saying it was just stress. I listened, and it felt strange how easy it was to hear their words now without letting them enter my chest. Because once you see the pattern clearly, the sentences stop having power. I told them no again, and this time it wasn't a fight. It was a boundary. I offered them two options: leave quietly tonight, or I call the security company that I pay from my account under my contract, and they escort the luggage right back out the way it came in. I didn't smile when I said it. I didn't enjoy it. I just meant it. My son looked at me like I was a stranger, like he'd just noticed I was a person with limits instead of a resource with feelings. That look hurt more than I expected, not because it was insulting, but because it proved what I'd been trying not to admit for too long. He hadn't been treating me like his mother. He'd been treating me like a background setting, something stable and quiet that existed to support his decisions without interrupting them. He asked me very quietly if I was really going to do this to him, and I told him even more quietly, I'm not doing anything to you. I'm stopping what you've been doing to me. For a moment, nobody moved. The suitcases sat there like evidence. The air felt heavy, like the whole house was holding its breath with me. In the end, they left. Not because they suddenly respected me, but because they finally understood I was not bluffing. My daughter-in-law pulled the luggage back toward the elevator with stiff movements, angry but careful, like she wanted to slam something but didn't want to give me the satisfaction. My son followed, slower, like each step away from my door was a step away from the version of himself who could still pretend he wasn't wrong. Right before the doors closed, he looked back at me and his eyes were full of something complicated, part resentment, part fear, part shame. I didn't wave. I didn't call him back. I didn't chase him with forgiveness. I just stood there and let him feel the consequence. When the elevator doors shut, I locked my front door, leaned my forehead against it for one long second, and led not because I'd won, because I'd finally stopped losing. Later that night, my phone buzzed with messages that tried to reopen the same old argument. Long paragraphs, short accusations, a few guilt lines designed to stab quickly. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The decision had already been made in the doorway when I asked that one simple question, the one they couldn't talk their way around. And the next morning, I woke up in a quiet house, made my coffee, and sat down like I belonged there because I did. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next disrespect. I felt like I was living in my own life again, and if they wanted to build something, they could build it on their own foundation, not on top of mine.